what are the best settings for this monitor? And by best settings, I mean the settings which I adopted in my review. It satisfied my colorimetric targets, which I usually go for in my reviews, and it suited my preferences. But remember that individual units and preferences vary, so these settings won't be optimal in all cases. I didn't really change a huge amount, so I stuck with the standard setting. For Smart Image, these are the presets of the monitor. If you want to use a different one, you can, but different settings will add different filters and different effects. The image is best balanced really with the standard setting. Console mode and standard on my unit were very similar by default, but you can use multiple presets if you wish and change the values independently for things like brightness, gamma, and the color temperature. The low blue mode may appeal to some people as well. It gives a warm greenish tint to things and you can't change the color channels yourself because the low blue light setting makes various adjustments there to achieve what it sets out to achieve. You can adjust the brightness independently, but I'd actually recommend if you want a low blue light style setting, then stick to standard, or you could use console mode or game 2, game 1. They're very similar once you configure them in the same way, but change color temperature to 5000K. That gives a warm amber tint to the image without that greenish yellow tint that the low blue mode gives, and this is a very effective low blue light setting as well. But I actually left this set to preset for my general usage of the monitor. Native and preset seem to be exactly the same. Perhaps it does depend on the preset you're using, but on standard it certainly seems to be the same. So I didn't have to change the RGB settings, the color channels. My unit was really nicely configured out of the box in terms of the red, green and blue color channels. But if you do need to change them, you'd have to set RGB settings to on, and that allows you to customize the red, green and blue channels. Some people may prefer to use the sRGB setting. And what that will do is that will clamp the gamut closer to sRGB and give more faithful representation of most content you consume under SDR, and that is designed with the sRGB color space in mind, rather than using the wider gamut of the monitor, which actually covers a lot of Adobe RGB and DCI-P3, so much wider than sRGB. That will give a more saturated and vibrant look, which some may prefer. And I like to use that when I'm testing monitors and then I look at the sRGB settings separately. Just be aware that if you are using the sRGB setting, you can't adjust the color channels. You might think you can, but if you set this to on, it actually disables the sRGB setting. But with the sRGB setting, you can adjust the brightness, and the brightness setting is remembered independently for sRGB on versus off. Just a little thing to note. You can't change gamma using the sRGB setting either. It says sRGB value will change to 6500K. So if you want to change the gamma, again, it turns sRGB off. So back to the best settings. I lowered the brightness to 60, and that got close to 160 nits on my unit, which is the usual target that I go for when I'm reviewing monitors, and it suits my lighting conditions. Please do adjust this according to your own preferences and lighting conditions though. So that's really all I did, just stuck to standard mode, reduced the brightness to 60. Also, if you want to use VRR, make sure that adaptive sync is set to on in game mode. That will grey out low input lag, but it is basically set to on when it's greyed out and you're using adaptive sync. If you have adaptive sync set to off, you're not using adaptive sync, then just make sure low input lag is set to on. There's no disadvantage to having this set to on rather than off. And remember, when you're using adaptive sync, it's forced on anyway. So I don't really know why they add this setting. I guess it's just for marketing purposes and people like to see it. But don't be freaked out if it's greyed out and you're using adaptive sync. It will be greyed out, and it's going to be set to on anyway. The monitor certainly has low input lag. I'm now going to enable HDR, switching my attention over to that. I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, running the game under HDR. Menu's a bit different now. So adaptive sync, again, you can use that. You can use VRR at the same time as HDR if you wish, that's fine. In Smart Image, it says Smart Image HDR now. The presets are different. So it's difficult to recommend a best setting here because, to be completely honest, the calibration of this monitor under HDR is far from perfect, regardless of how you set it up. But my general recommendation would be stick to HDR Game, Movie or Vivid. You can set them up in the same way and they'll give you a very similar image. They're just set differently by default. And I like to have brightness set to 100, contrast set to 50. So they're really the default neutral values. If you happen to find things too bright, well, consider reducing the brightness, but that will affect your PQ curve and things won't be calibrated as well. Things will start looking quite flooded and dim. So it doesn't simply remap things neatly, just be aware of that. if you start reducing brightness and you're noticing things don't look right. Light enhancement and color enhancement. As the word enhancement suggests, if you actually set this anything above 0, then it's giving you an additional filter. So the most accurate and neutral image would really be with these set to 0, and that's what I like. So the light enhancement, increasing this, basically lifts up the shadow details, but it's not just the shadow details, it also lifts up a lot of medium shades. So if you're finding you really want to improve visibility, you really just want to lift things up a bit, then feel free to use light enhancement. That's really what it does. Color enhancement, that's a saturation boost. So it will oversaturate things. If it's set to 1, it's quite a gentle effect. It doesn't give you strong oversaturation at all. And set to 2, it's a little bit stronger. Set to 3, stronger again. And this is really something, again, which I would suggest you can set according to your own preferences. But my preference is for this to be set to 0. In terms of the HDR calibration, HDR True Black is actually better calibrated. If you want to use that but make a few adjustments yourself on top of that, you can set the monitor to personal. And that offers more of an HDR True Black-like calibration, but it also allows you to adjust things like the brightness, contrast, and the light enhancement and color enhancement features. Or specifically, that's exactly what it lets you adjust. So all of those little settings. But the HDR True Black setting, it will limit the brightness output of the monitor to closer to around 500 nits, can be a little bit above that in some scenes, rather than around double that, which it will be using for the HDR Vivid, movie, or game settings. But it does map things better, it's better calibrated within that range. And it will also mean that the ABL automatic brightness limiter behavior of the monitor isn't as obvious under HDR, because when it peaks at around 1000 nits, for some scenes it will drop down significantly when there's a lot of bright shades on the screen. So if you want things to be more consistent, then yes, you can use the True Black setting, or personal if you want to make your own adjustments. As I mentioned in the review, I do actually quite like using the HDR True Black setting over one of the ones that will give the maximum brightness, so HDR Game, for example, or Movie or Vivid. And that's because of the superior calibration. And in games like Cyberpunk, I do notice this. If you're noticing lots of blown out highlights and that kind of thing, you'll probably find HDR True Black a bit better in that respect than some of the other settings. I'm just going to quickly go through a few other settings now just to round things off. They call it StarkShadowBoost. I think it's supposed to be called DarkShadowBoost, or maybe they've renamed it to StarkShadowBoost. Interesting name. Anyway, this is something you might want to use if you want a competitive edge. I've just moved the OSD over to the right side of the screen so you can see those blocks a bit better. Be aware that what you see with the blocks is not what you'd see by eye. It is quite different in the video, but it will give you a rough idea of what this so-called StarkShadowBoost setting does. So set this to 1, it does boost up those shades. 2, it boosts them further. 3, boosts them further. So the visibility is pretty good at level 3 really, in terms of even the darkest blocks on this test, but it doesn't upset the black depth, so it doesn't upset your contrast, so it's a bit more selective. You might notice it does lighten up some of the medium to bright shades as well, so it's not super selective, but it really is more the dark to medium dark shades which it affects. So if you are finding you really want a competitive edge, you want to improve your visibility, then do feel free to use this Shadow Boost setting, set up to level 3. Very last thing to go through, OLED panel care, and that's in the setup section of the menu. There's a screensaver setting, and what that will do is it will dim the screen if no movement is detected on the screen. So it won't trigger with little movements like a cursor blinking or the clock changing or anything like that. So that won't stop it activating, And you can set that to slow, which will take a bit longer to activate, or fast, which will activate more quickly. I don't use this setting, and I'm not suggesting this is a best setting, where really you have to set these according to your own preferences, but I have it set to off just to make sure this isn't interrupting the review in any way when I'm taking measurements and that kind of thing. There's pixel orbiting, so there's an active area around the image, so between the image itself and the panel border, and the screen bounces around within that. It just moves up, down, left or right, just slowly, every now and then, just nudges the pixels slightly. I'm happy to have this set to slow, which I believe is the default, although you'd think normal would be the default, so maybe I'm misremembering. But I'm happy with this set to slow anyway. I don't really notice this, I don't find it bothersome. It just does this occasionally, this little nudging behaviour, and it does help reduce the chance of image retention and could potentially reduce some burn-in occurring. Or you can have that set to normal or fast if you want a more aggressive approach to this and you don't mind it nudging the image a bit more frequently. Or if it's really bothering you, even set to slow, you could consider having this set to off. Be aware that none of these settings are going to completely eliminate your chance of burn-in. There's always a burn-in risk, especially for prolonged use of the monitor and over time. But they're just mitigation measures to help reduce the chance of that occurring so quickly, or potentially at all in some scenarios. There's also a pixel refresh cycle. So this has an associated setting called auto warning. This is set to on by default, and that will give a message on the screen every now and then. I think it starts after 4 hours, and then it will appear every 2 hours after that until the refresh cycle is run. Just reminding you to run the refresh cycle, and you can press OK to run it or something like that on the message. But the message appears for about 5 to 10 seconds and then disappears. But if you're finding the message annoying or you just don't want the message, you don't need it, then just do what I've done and set auto warning to off. The pixel refresh cycle, if you want to run it manually, you can do that by pressing proceed here where it says pixel refresh, but it will run it automatically. It will want to run it after 4 hours of cumulative use, and it will run it if the monitor goes into standby, enters a low power state. So that would be if you let it do so because a signal to the system is lost and a little bit of time has elapsed, then it will just run the cycle automatically. Or if you press the power button of the monitor as if you're switching it off, but it's as long as it's still getting power from your mains, then it can also run the cycle that way. So really it's just something that will occur in the background when you're not using the monitor, well that's the idea. And you can see in OLED information, it gives you the working time, so how long you've been using the monitor in total, and how long after the last pixel refresh, and the pixel refresh count, so how many times it's actually run the cycle. I just let the monitor go to sleep after 3 minutes of inactivity through Windows Power Management, and that way it tends to just run its cycles if I'm not at the computer for a little bit of time.